Hello everyone, welcome to ASEAN Pacific episodes. In these conversations, I'm joining by Ray Powell. He's one of the most updated South China Sea observers. I believe that in this conversation, we are talking too many things, so many details about the South China Sea, one of the most contested maritime region in the world. And before jumping to the conversation and question, I'm going to introduce my guest to you, the followers. Ray is a founder and director of SeaLight, a maritime transparency project of the Guardian Knot Center for National Security Innovation at Stanford University, California. SeaLight uses commercially available technology to monitor and publicly report gray zone maritime activities in the South China Sea. Ray concluded a 35-year career in the United States Air Force in November 2021, retiring as a colonel. He served as an Air Force attaché to Vietnam from 2013 to 2016, and defense attaché to Australia from 2017 to 2020. His other assignments have included Japan, Germany, 2 tours to Qatar, and 3 in the Pentagon. He also deployed on combat tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. Ray was a 2021 fellow at the Distinguished Career Institute at Stanford University. Welcome, Ray. Thank you for joining my show.
Thanks, Lokman. Good morning from Washington, D.C.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Ray, just let me start for junior researcher or international relations students. What is exactly the South China Sea for these students? What is the significance of this maritime region? And what are the underlying reasons behind the persistent disputes in this region among the state holders, the maritime countries in the region, and also great powers like the United States and China? They are I think, in the fierce competition in this region. Could you please little bit tell us about this maritime region?
Sure. Well, as the name implies, Lokman, the South China Sea is the waters just south of China, and it is surrounded by the Southeast Asian countries, the maritime countries, the Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, Indonesia, and Vietnam. And going back many, many years, in fact, so really maybe especially into the early 70s, there has been a lot of competition among these countries over who can lay claim to what small island or rock or reef. And for a long time, this competition was really about oil, because there was a lot of thought that there was a lot of oil down there. So that's what originally got people excited about this part of the world. So there have been minor skirmishes. Probably the most significant have been in 1974. There was a battle between South Vietnam and China over the Paracel Islands, which are closer into to Hainan Island. And then also in 1988, there was actually a fight between China and the unified Vietnam over South Johnson Reef and the Spratly Islands. And both of those cases, China was the victor and took control of the features. In recent years, it's been more and more about not just about who controls which reef or shoal, but who controls the water around them. And so this has turned into a question of the freedom of navigation, of jurisdiction over waters, various waters. And it has become especially contentious because under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, a nation is only allowed to claim territorial seas up to 12 nautical miles from their coastline or from what the UN considers to be an island. And most of what is in the South China Sea is not considered to be islands. They're considered to be rocks and reefs and shoals. So nobody in those cases gets a territorial sea regardless. And nobody gets an exclusive economic zone, which is the zone that you can claim to own the resources like the oil or gas or like the fish. And yet in recent years, what we've seen is that China has done several things. One is about 10 years ago, it built out many of the shoals into large military bases, including 3 military grade airfield. And then they've done is to grow out the size of their Navy Coast Guard and what they call the Maritime Militia. And so there are a lot of Chinese ships out there, of course, Chinese in the South China Sea, and it's a very large body of water. And then, finally, China has sort of aggressively begun to sort of patrol all of these places and deny other countries access to certain parts of the South China Sea. And the most noteworthy, of course, recently has been the Philippines, which China has at various times denied access to certain fishing grounds and a very noteworthy Philippine outpost in the Spratly Islands.
Right. Could you hear me?
Yes.
Most recently, when we come to the South China Sea, why has there been a surge in diplomatic efforts, realignment of forces, and forging the military partnerships between the United States and its allies located to the South China Sea region, and the United States and its allies perceiving a significant threat, or what is the reason behind this regrouping and military activities and deployments?
So a couple of things happened that have sort of all of this out. And 122, Marcos Jr. became the president of the Philippines, Rodrigo Duterte. Duterte's policy toward the South China Sea, or what the Philippines calls the West Philippine Sea, was fairly subdued. Duterte really wanted to curry favor with Beijing. And so very little information came out about what was happening in the West Philippine Sea. And when President Marcos took office in early 2023, the Philippines began to put out a lot of information, especially visual information. So there were pictures and videos of the harassments that were happening by, Chinese Coast Guard and Maritime Militia vessels harassing the Philippine Coast Guard vessels and their resupply efforts at Second Thomas Shoal, harassments of fishermen or fisheries protection vessels at Scarborough Shoal. These kinds of things began to come out, and China has reacted very strongly to this. They don't like the exposure, and so they have decided to try to escalate with the Philippines. So they began to aggressively begin to block and swarm the Philippine ships when they were out, and especially beginning last August, began increased use of water cannons. And water cannons are considered a non-lethal weapon, but when pointed at a small boat, and some of these boats that the Philippines are using are wooden boats, so they can cause quite a lot of damage. And that's what's been happening recently. And so because the Philippines is a treaty ally of the United States, that has begun to bring into question whether some of these activities could result in damage or loss of life, and then would any of these things invoke the 1951 Mutual Defense Treaty between the Philippines and the United States. So, of course, what you saw then a couple of weeks ago was a summit in Washington, D.C. between President Joe Biden, President Marcos from the Philippines, and Prime Minister Kishida from Japan. And this trilateral summit spoke a great deal about the harassment in the South China Sea against the Philippines, and both the United States and Japan came out in very strong support of the Philippines and made a lot of promises to the Philippines about ways in which they would both support the Philippines, both with security and economics. So the Philippines so I think all of this lends very much credit belongs to the Philippines for exposing all of this activity. And frankly, a lot of credit belongs to China for causing the problem in the first place, which has earned the Philippines all of this extra attention from the U.S. and its allies.
Right. Let me rephrase my question from the China's perspectives. What recent developments have prompted Beijing to escalate tensions with the Chinese ships, resorting to actions like the firing water cannons you mentioned and ramming into the Philippine vessels? Is this escalation linked to the Marcos government in Manila aligning more closely with regional strategies of the United States, or because in China, in Philippines, when government change, the policies also is changed from the shifting from the United States to the from China, like Duterte and Marcos most recently.
Very much so. Yeah. So, I mean, the Philippines being a democracy does have changes in policy when it has changes in presidents. And so, yes, that has a lot to do with it. You saw, and frankly, as I said, China's own behavior has caused a lot of this. President Marcos went to China very early in his presidency and came back with not a lot. There were not a lot of sort of new promises made to Marcos. And I think that, if China had wanted to try to bring, Marcos into its orbit, that was probably their opportunity, and they didn't really seem to do anything. So Marcos turned to the United States, which is again the traditional ally of his country, and began to expand what we call the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, or EDCA, and grew the number of sites under EDCA. So there were 5 EDCA sites before, and these EDCA sites are sites in which the United States doesn't have bases, but it does have access. And so the Philippines had 5 of these sites where the U.S. military had increased access, and now they've grown it by 4 more sites. So now they have a total of 9. And so China is reacting to this. China is reacting to the overall tenor of the U.S.-Philippine relationship. And China is reacting to the pictures that the Philippines has been publishing about its harassments. The Philippines has embarked on what we've been calling at SeaLight an assertive transparency campaign. So actively going out and seeking the incidents of Chinese vessel swarms in Philippine sovereign waters, or things like this. And China is reacting to those pictures. They don't like the pictures, and they think that the Philippines, by publishing the pictures, is being provocative. The Philippines, of course, does not believe that the pictures themselves are provocative, but the acts that they're taking pictures of, the Chinese acts, are provocative. And I think the Philippines probably has the better of that argument.
I'm going to ask about the importance of Taiwan, because Taiwan is surrounded by the South China Sea maritime disputes. When we come to the Taiwan as a disputed country between the United States and China as a great power, what is the importance of the South China Sea in Beijing's invasion to Taiwan, or incorporate Taiwan into the mainland?
So Taiwan is often treated as a separate issue from the South China Sea. Obviously, they are adjacent to one another. Sort of, Taiwan is, and actually Taiwan, interestingly, because it mimics Beijing's policies, since both claim to be China, both the People's Republic of China and the Republic of China, which is Taiwan. So Taiwan actually claims the same space in the South China Sea that Beijing does. The difference is that Taiwan does not have the capacity or the interest, apparently, in trying to enforce that claim, where Beijing is very interested in that. So Taiwan is also of great interest to the Philippines, because if there is a contingency involving Taiwan, it has a lot of implications for the Philippines. One, of course, is that means war is possible very, very close to Philippine borders. 2, of course, is that the United States would want and seek access to those EDCA sites as places from which to prosecute a war if it happened involving the United States. 3 is there would certainly be large refugee flows, and there are a lot of Philippine workers in Taiwan right now, and so a lot of those refugees would be Filipinos trying to get out of Taiwan. And then, of course, there would be other refugees, and the Philippines is very close by and would probably be the first place that refugees would try to get to, since the only other, the other closest country is China itself. So, there's a lot of interest in the Philippines about what could happen if there was a Taiwan emergency. As far as Taiwan's involvement in any sort of contingency over the South China Sea, I assume that Taiwan would probably want to stay out of that. It's got enough problems of its own, although it is of interest that Taiwan actually does have one of the Spratly Islands, and they have a small port and an airfield there. And so Taiwan would have interest in trying to defend its interests in the South China Sea.
Yes. Okay. When we're considering the ongoing US-China relations in the region and recent tensions between the Filipino and also maybe we can add the developments, military developments in the Japan. Japan also another important countries and US allies in the region. How likely is the military conflict in the South China Seas? Do you see any clue or signals?
I generally think that all of the countries involved right now are eager to avoid open conflict. That is why, China as the aggressor nation, and I use that word advisedly, because the Philippines and the United States have not shown any interest in changing the status quo, where China is the country that is trying to change the status quo by pushing out other countries or taking over, certain features. So China is the aggressor nation. Even China does not want to do it via open conflict. They're trying to do it, for example, at Second Thomas Shoal. Essentially, what they have done is set up a blockade of the shoal to try to deny the Philippines the ability to repair or replace the rusty ship that has become their outpost. So the Second Thomas Shoal is an extremely interesting case because in 1995, the Philippines discovered that China had erected some structures at Mischief Reef, and Mischief Reef lies within the Philippines exclusive economic zone and is just about 30 kilometers away from Second Thomas Shoal, also in the Philippines exclusive economic zone. And in response, the Philippines took a old World War II era ship that came from the United States originally and ran it aground on Second Thomas Shoal as a way to counter China's move in erecting the structures at Mischief Reef. And so for 25 years, there have been these two opposing places, two reefs in the South China Sea, one with Chinese structures and the other with a Philippine ship. And in the intervening years, the Chinese structures turned into a very large military base where China created an artificial island, poured concrete, and made a huge military-grade airfield and lots of support structures. And the Philippine ship, has basically rusted the entire time. So today, there's a military base at Mischief Reef for China and a rusty ship for the Philippines. And China has been using the military base to essentially blockade the Philippines outpost. So that has turned into kind of the main flashpoint where you see a lot of those pictures come back are the Philippines' efforts to resupply that rusty ship out at Second Thomas Shoal. And so China, the reason all this is important in terms of conflict, one is, of course, everybody worries that some kind of incident during the blockade running that the Philippines has been doing could turn into something that causes conflict. But the other is that China has not tried to remove the ship or assault the ship or the rusty ship, because China knows that would certainly invoke the Mutual Defense Treaty with the United States, and China is not interested in beginning a major war with the United States over a rusty ship in the South China Sea.
Some maritime region, Ray, one of the South China Sea, one of the most important strategic maritime region in the world, especially between the US and China in terms of the great power competitions. And on the other hand, there is a significant amount of trade flow passing through the Bashi Channel and from the Malacca Strait to the South China Sea, towards South China Sea. And when we look at the recent developments at the other part of the world, like the crisis in Gaza and in Ukraine, do you think, is there any link between for example, through the Red Sea and in terms of the sea line of the communications and global the US-China competition? And even when we're talking about, someone argued that there is a realignment between the Russia, China, and the Iran and North Korea proxies. What kind of the implication will have the South China Sea, and will have on the Beijing calculation and the US calculation, US containment strategy in the region, And what will be your take on this question?
So I have a couple of thoughts. One is that we have seen in the Red Sea, and with the ongoing confrontation there, what the effect of even a small group like the Houthis in Yemen can have on international shipping. We've seen a lot of because the Houthis began to assault or cause problems for ships in the Red Sea. A lot of international trade had to be rerouted, and of course that drives everyone's costs up and things. And so it's a reminder that sea lines of communication, or sea lanes as we often will just call them, are extremely important. And you can imagine if a small group like the Houthis can cause that much trouble on one part of the world, what could a large country like China, if it wanted to restrict shipping in the South China Sea as it gains more and more maritime capability, it could really cause a lot of problems for international shipping. The other thing that I would say about that is that the conflict in Ukraine, the conflict in the Middle East, and the conflict, the less open conflict over the South China Sea and potentially Taiwan, has caused an increased interconnectedness between certain aggressor nations, and especially Russia, Iran, and China. And you've begun to see the evolution of what we would often call an axis between these three countries. They are not formal allies, and they don't work closely together. But you've seen increased cooperation in them. You've seen an alignment on messaging. There have been some exercises between China and Russia. You've seen a lot of Chinese-made weapons or equipment appearing in the Russia-Ukraine war, and you've seen, before you saw some Iranian equipment as well. So you've begun to see these countries begin to come together strategically. Again, they are not formally aligned with one another, formally allied, but you've seen a convergence of interest as all three countries see it in their interest to sort of increase their cooperation. So those of us, of course, who study history, the last time we heard the word axis, in terms of a conflict, or one of the times we heard the word was the Axis powers in World War II, and we would certainly be worried about seeing something like that emerge, because of course nobody is looking for World War III.
Right, especially in the recent U.S.-China relations, and as part of the China's aims to open the Pacific and became a global superpower, and the U.S. containment strategy, especially, what kind of the peaceful resolutions that international organization can play and mitigate these disputes in the maritime region? Because when the conflict happened, or in a war scenario, I think all the not all, but the most significant the trade flow of the world will be cut, and all other part of the world will be under the implication of this scenario. What kind of these organizations, such as ASEAN, can play a constructive role and mitigate the disputes and ongoing tensions between China, between the US, between the China and their neighbors countries, especially the Philippines and China, and maybe in the next step, maybe Japan and China?
Yeah. With regard to ASEAN, ASEAN has not really proved able to sort of mitigate this problem, or to negotiate it. There has been an ongoing discussion at ASEAN for a century code of conduct in the South China Sea, and an effort between the ASEAN countries and China to hammer out some kind of rules of the road so that things like what we're seeing now don't happen. But it has not gone anywhere. It's really, sort of been frustrated at every level. And this is, due to a couple of things. One is that ASEAN is a very fractured organization. They actually have, the countries involved in the ASEAN, which is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, have very different interests, and they are. And then the other thing is that some of these countries have become more aligned with China, and of course the Philippines in particular is more aligned with the United States. You know, only for the countries specific interests, and the other countries, you know, are not really interested in antagonizing China by joining their ASEAN partners in developing rules that might not honor China's expansive claims. So China has a lot of influence in countries like Cambodia and Laos, and of course Myanmar, which is due to the civil war there, is probably less able to get involved anyway. But China's influence in those places keeps ASEAN from developing any kind of consensus. But ultimately, the issue over the code of conduct is that the end goals for the ASEAN countries and China are just too different. China's objective is to consolidate its control over almost all of the South China Sea, including areas and features like reefs and shoals that are owned and occupied by the other countries, especially Malaysia, Vietnam, and the Philippines. And of course, those countries don't want that to happen. And so because the goals are different, they can't agree even on the language. And so what we've seen happen with ASEAN is that the code of conduct negotiations have just turned into one way for China to sort of stall all the other countries or hold them in place while China consolidates its effective control over the South China Sea.
Well, I think that the fake news and disinformations play a different role in the South China Sea issues. And how can these fake news and disinformation campaigns be countered to prevent misunderstandings, escalation in the South China Sea disputes? What will be your take?
So I see a couple of different versions of fake news. So because I spend time looking at, for example, Philippine YouTube websites, there are many YouTubes out there that claim that there's active conflict going on now, and that the United States just destroyed 1,000 Chinese ships, and things that you and I can laugh about because they're so ridiculous. Apparently, some of these sites have followers, and they're led to believe that all of these things are actually happening. So I think most of that is frivolous, and you can sort of roll your eyes and say, what a foolish thing to follow these reports when you know that there can't possibly be 1,000 Chinese ships sunk in a day, and nobody would know about it. But the more common sort of fake news that you see is essentially Chinese propaganda, which is state policy. And essentially what that is it is statements of China's position formed in the way and sold as if it is a news story or a fact. So for example, there's a confrontation between a Philippine ship and a Chinese ship, and the Chinese ship water cannons the Philippine ship. And the fact of this is very clear because you can see the picture of the Chinese water cannon. Again, a large Chinese ship water cannoning a small Philippine boat. And then the news story will come out of sort of say the Global Times or CGTN or some of these state outlets, and they will say, well, the Philippines is provoking China. China has, quote, indisputable sovereignty over the Spratly Islands and, quote, relevant waters. And this is, by just repeating over and over and over again China's claims as if they are facts, China seeks to sort of shape the narrative so that eventually people will start to repeat those things. Oh, China has indisputable sovereignty. Well, that must mean that the Philippines is wrong. And so by continuously framing the narrative and saying it over and over and over again, and of course, they also have people who, for whatever reason, parrot or repeat their narrative for them. There are people in Manila and in the United States and other places, whether some may be getting money from certain Chinese-aligned outlets or people or businesses or government officials that encourage them to continue using this language. Some may just be ideologically aligned with China, but regardless, this kind of narrative shaping is part of China's political warfare, cognitive warfare, as we might call it, to try to shape the way that we think about all of these things.
All right, from here, just let me touch a small point. Your SeaLight projects, how can contribute these developments and the disputes and spread the objective news and information
Sure.
to our part of the world?
So what we do at SeaLight, and thanks for bringing that up. So we have a couple of outlets. I have my own X or Twitter feed, which is at Gordian Not Ray, and then we have our SeaLight.live website. And what we try to do is we try to use commercial technology, so satellite pictures or ship tracking, to illuminate what we see happening in the South China Sea. So especially if, in some cases where the word doesn't get out. For example, yesterday, I put out on my Twitter feed that there was an incident in which a large China Coast Guard ship went into Vietnam's exclusive economic zone, drove around through Vietnam's oil and gas fields, and then returned back to its original station. And those ships, those Chinese ships, do that intrusively into other countries' exclusive economic zones to assert China's claims. And Vietnam, for its part, all it could do is really follow the ship around. Now, the ship is not doing anything technically illegal under the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea. The ship has freedom of navigation. You are allowed to drive around, right? You can go in places that are not your exclusive economic zone, but someone else's exclusive economic zone, as long as you don't go into their territorial sea in that 12 nautical mile smaller area closer to the coast. But it is intended, so it's not the activity that's illegal, but it's the intent of the activity, which is to normalize China's jurisdiction over Vietnam's oil and gas fields. So China, by constantly doing this, is seeking to make it to make a point that this area that legally under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea belongs to Vietnam, at least the resources there. China is trying to essentially send the message that no, it doesn't, because China has historic claims to this and it intends to see those claims realized. And so by constantly running its Coast Guard ship through that area, it reminds Vietnam that China's claims are active and will continue to be asserted. And someday, whenever it feels strong enough, China will almost certainly try to consolidate those claims and make it so that Vietnam is unable to, for example, continue to operate its oil and gas activities out there. I mean, Vietnam has already been prevented from new exploration on many occasions by China because China claims those waters. So that's the way that we see that happen, and this is what we tend to refer to as gray zone activities, and we call it the gray zone because what China does there tends to be opaque, and oftentimes they will deny it. And what we at SeaLight do is say, well, you can't deny this because we actually see it right before our eyes on this ship tracking.
The South China Sea has so many dimensions. Now I'm going to ask another questions. What role can the new technologies like artificial intelligence and autonomous drones play in the future confrontation in the South China Sea? Because as per my information, I know the majority of the South China Sea has been dominated by autonomous region. There is under the sea world, another world. Now we are talking about the surface, but there is another world in under sea in the South China Sea. What kind of the role these technologies and artificial intelligence can play in this important region and disputed region between the two great powers?
So I think what we're going to see in the future, and we're already seeing it now, in fact, we're taking advantage at SeaLight, is an increased public awareness of what happens in this vast maritime region. So maritime space has always been a little bit mysterious to most people because we don't see what happens there. But the advances in satellite technology, in uncrewed vehicles, for example, what we call surface vehicles, undersea vehicles, aerial drones, and then, of course, as you mentioned, artificial intelligence. What artificial intelligence does is it takes all of these data feeds that these sensors collect, and it's able to sort of put them all into a big, essentially, computation and identify trends and anomalies that maybe the human eye couldn't necessarily see, but it can do it very quickly because of the computational power. So the more we see more and more sensors, and again, space sensors, undersea sensors, surface sensors, aerial sensors, that creates more data. All of that data then can be fed into artificial intelligence and produce a lot of awareness of what's happening in places like the South China Sea. So, and that's going to become more and more publicly available as well. So it's going to become a lot less mysterious, and activities like we see now that are only evident because somebody like me at SeaLight or someone else, goes and does a lot of looking and searching around and then analyzing, and it might take days or weeks or months. Soon will be able to happen almost instantaneously and automatically, and everyone will simply know what's happening at all times. I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Oh, sorry, my mic is off. I'm just concluding our conversation with the last comment or questions. What will be your future prospects, assumptions about the South China Sea, especially the United States? Maybe the government will be changed, the administration will be changed, maybe
Sure.
The possibility after the election. And also in the Philippines, they have the similar issues. Maybe after the Marcos, another China-friendly leader will come to power. We don't know. Maybe US-friendly. What will be your prospects and assumptions about this region for the next 5 years or next 10 years? Because also China has calculations according to the US and other countries' assumptions that someone give the date, maybe China will invade Taiwan in 2049 or 2027. What will be the importance of the South China Sea, and what kind of the skin we will see in this region?
So I am not one who sees a lot of discontinuity in this part of the world from one US administration to another. Although I will say, actually, if it were to be another Trump administration, actually the turn toward a more confrontational policy toward China began in the Trump administration, the first Trump administration. So if that were to change, I'm not sure that you would. I don't necessarily think you would see any. There's actually been a lot of continuity from Trump to Biden, and so if it went back to Trump, the continuity I would expect might largely continue in this part of the world. If the question of whether 2028 would bring in another Duterte administration or somebody else that has similar views, I mean, that's always something you think about in democracies. That different. That's an ongoing feature of every democracy. I will say that one thing that was true in the first Duterte administration, of course, Rodrigo Duterte was personally very opposed to the United States and brought that opposition with him into office. And yet, even after 6 years, never succeeded in sort of pulling apart the U.S.-Philippine alliance or the visiting forces agreement or the things that that you would be most concerned about. Those things turned out to be institutionally very, very powerful. And so even under a first Duterte administration, that did not change. So I'm a person who's pretty optimistic going forward on that sense. The question about Taiwan, of course, is on everyone's mind, and there have been discussions about, as you mentioned, 2027. There was even discussion about 2025 not long ago, because one U.S. general suggested that there was the U.S. needed to be ready to fight by then because things could happen that quickly. I still tend to believe that China is not interested in going to war over Taiwan. It wants to try to get what it can by coercion. And so I think that it uses the threat of conflict as a way to try to get to coerce Taiwan into moving in China's direction. It hasn't been successful in that yet. And in Taiwan's recent elections, it brought the same party back into power. And so, China's threats of force have not worked out in China's favor, I don't think. But you've seen a steady increase in pressure, and I would expect China to continue to put the pressure on Taiwan, and maybe even, begin to make it harder and harder, say, for ships to get between Taiwan's various islands, or back and forth between Taiwan and other countries. So you could see kind of a gradual ramping up of pressure below the level of armed conflict, but sort of trying to get Taiwan to bend in Beijing's direction. I would expect that to continue.
Thank you very much, Ray, for sharing your valuable experience with us, with my audiences.
All right, it's been a pleasure. Thanks, Lokman.
And for audiences also, please visit Ray's website, SeaLight.com. Am I right?
SeaLight.live.
Oh, SeaLight.live.
I think if you go to SeaLight.com, it will try to sell you lights that are used in the sea. But I think so. You have to go to SeaLight.live to find us.
And how to find you on the X platform? So
it's at Gordian, not Ray, all one word. So there's the old saying that the old story about Alexander the Great having to cut the Gordian knot to solve the problem, and that's what we were trying to do in the South China Sea. So I'm Gordian, not Ray.
Oh, that is nice. Thank you very much. And for audiences, please don't forget to subscribe to my channel and push the notification button for upcoming live streams. And thanks, Ray, again for joining me from the California, whether from the United States. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thanks, Lokman.
Okay.